In an age when China was torn into three kingdoms, armies clashed by the hundreds of thousands. Yet history would remember not the sword, but the mind that guided it. Amid the chaos of the Battle of Red Cliffs, one man stood against the might of Cao Cao's invincible northern army, not with legions or steel, but with wit, patience, and the whisper of the wind itself. His name was Zhuge Liang, the sleeping dragon, a strategist so brilliant that his schemes blurred the line between logic and sorcery. When the enemy outnumbered his allies 10-1, he conjured miracles from nature, borrowing arrows from the fog and summoning the eastern wind that would turn fire into a weapon of destiny. To some, he was a tactician. To others, a magician who commanded heaven's will. But to history, Zhuge Liang became something greater, the embodiment of intellect triumphing over power. And tonight, we'll witness how one man, with nothing but bamboo, straw, and the breath of the east wind, changed the fate of an empire. The borrowed arrows, the stratagem in the mist. The night hung heavy over the Yangtze, thick with fog that swallowed sound and shadow alike. The river lay calm, its waters dark and reflective, as if waiting for something unseen, some invisible hand to stir it into chaos. From the southern bank, 20 small boats slipped silently across the mist, their presence barely more than a whisper against the river's vast expanse. Upon the deck of the leading vessel stood Zhuge Liang, the strategist of Shu, known to many as the Sleeping Dragon. His robes flowed with the damp wind, and his fan rested lightly in his hand. He did not hold a sword, nor any instrument of death, but in his gaze burned a certainty more dangerous than any blade. Every line of his face, every measured breath, radiated the calm of one who had already foreseen the outcome. Behind him, General Lu Su leaned forward, his unease barely contained. "The fog is thick," Lu Su whispered, his voice trembling in the mist. "If they spot us, we're finished before we begin." Zhuge Liang's lips curved into the faintest smile, eyes scanning the horizon shrouded in gray. "Let them see," he said softly. "That is the plan." The southern fleet advanced with silent precision, their movements masked by the swirling mist. Each boat carried bundles of straw, bound and shaped to mimic soldiers. They were motionless, faceless, a shadow army drifting toward the enemy, like ghosts summoned by a mind that had mastered foresight itself. From afar, Cao Cao's scouts perched in wooden towers strained their eyes through the fog. "Enemy ships approaching from the south," a sentry cried, his voice cutting through the stillness like an alarm bell. The northern camp stirred into a frenzy. Cao Cao's generals barked orders, and from the fleet, 1,000 bows drew taut. The night erupted in a symphony of steel and tension. Arrows whistled through the mist, striking with deadly precision, or so the soldiers believed. But the fog was merciless, concealing the truth. They fired upon the river, aiming at shadows, at shapes that seemed human, but which were nothing more than straw and bound rope. Arrow after arrow rained down upon the vessels, embedding themselves in the straw soldiers. Each bundle bristled with 1,000 points of flying death, turning the humble boats into moving hedgehogs of steel. Lu Su gasped, incredulous, watching as the barrage continued hour after hour. Not a single life was lost, not a single soldier harmed. And through it all, Zhuge Liang remained serene. His fan rose and fell in slow, deliberate rhythm, almost in time with the beating hearts of those who watched in fear and awe. "The heavens have given us their gift," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind and the hiss of arrows meeting straw. 3 hours passed like minutes in the fog. Then, as if on cue, the first tendrils of dawn began to pierce the gray shroud. The fog lifted gradually, revealing the fleet, still intact, drifting back toward the southern shore. The straw soldiers were now adorned with 10,000 arrows, each one a trophy taken from the enemy's own arsenal. The northern army stared in disbelief, realizing too late that they had armed their opponent without knowing it. By the time Cao Cao grasped the cunning of the ruse, the southern fleet had vanished into the distance, leaving nothing but mist and stunned silence behind. Not a single man had been harmed, no swords had been drawn, and yet an entire campaign had been altered. The balance of power shifted, all through deception, intellect, and courage. As the boats returned to the southern camp, the soldiers erupted in cheers, shouting praises to the sleeping dragon. But Zhuge Liang did not celebrate. He merely turned to Lu Su, his face calm, almost unreadable, and said, "Victory favors not the strong, but the prepared." The river, now bathed in the soft gold of early morning, mirrored the strategist's calm. His eyes followed the rising sun, as if it carried the promise of future victories. Around him, his allies began to understand the weight of what had just occurred. Against impossible odds, in a war dominated by men of steel and iron, Zhuge Liang had turned the invisible forces of nature, the fog, the wind, the very perception of the enemy, into instruments of destiny. And so, the legend of the borrowed arrows was born, not through brute force, not through bloodshed, but through the sheer power of the mind, through patience, foresight, and the courage to bend reality itself. In that moment, the men of Shu witnessed something more than a clever trick. They saw the transformation of intellect into myth, of strategy into legend. Zhuge Liang had proven that in war, it is not the strength of your army, but the clarity of your vision, the cunning of your mind, and the ability to command the unseen that truly shapes history. And as the fog fully lifted, revealing the tranquil Yangtze once more, the soldiers knew that they had witnessed not merely a battle, but a glimpse of destiny itself, the hand of a man who had, for a brief but eternal moment, bent the forces of the world to his will. The eastern wind, the divine breath of battle. The river that night was silent, eerily silent. The Yangtze stretched wide beneath a shroud of mist, its waters dark and endless, reflecting a sky that held its breath. Not even the cry of a crane or the ripple of an oar disturbed its surface. It was as though the world itself waited, tense, suspended between the will of gods and the folly of men. To the north, Cao Cao's fleet loomed across the horizon, an ocean of iron and ambition. Over 800 warships, chained side by side, forming an unbroken wall of wood and steel that cut through the river like a blade. The warlord stood at the prow of his command vessel, his armor gleaming faintly in the moonlight, eyes fixed southward. He had conquered the Central Plains, crushed every rival who dared oppose him, and now sought to bring the South to heel. "The Empire," he once declared, "will kneel before me." But across the water, hidden among the fog and reeds, the alliance of Sun Quan and Liu Bei waited, a fragile union born not of trust, but of necessity. Their forces were fewer, their supplies dwindling, their men weary. Against Cao Cao's might, their armies seemed like reeds before a storm. Yet among them stood one man whose calm defied the terror around him, Zhuge Liang. The strategist, the mystic, the man who seemed to walk between heaven and earth. He was no warrior, no king, and yet his words carried the weight of fate. Soldiers spoke of him in whispers, calling him Wolong, the sleeping dragon. They said his mind could command the stars, his fan could summon storms, his eyes could see the patterns of destiny. As Cao Cao's army advanced, the allied camp was divided. Some urged retreat, others begged for a desperate assault. But Zhuge Liang stood silent, eyes lifted toward the sky. He did not look at the enemy's banners, nor at their weapons. Instead, he studied the clouds, the shifting mists, the rhythm of the wind. He turned to the commanders and said calmly, "Victory will not come by strength, it will come by the breath of heaven." The men stared in disbelief. Fire was their only chance, yes. But the wind was wrong. The western gusts blew straight toward their fleet. If they unleashed the flames now, they would burn themselves before touching Cao Cao's ships. Zhou Yu, proud and skeptical, asked bitterly, "Will you command the heavens, Master Zhuge?" Zhuge Liang's eyes glinted beneath the torchlight. "At the fifth watch," he said, "the east wind shall rise." Those words echoed through the camp like a spell, half prophecy, half madness. But something in his voice silenced doubt. It was not arrogance, it was certainty. The kind that comes only from one who has already seen the outcome. That night, beneath a veiled moon, Zhuge Liang ascended a small wooden altar built upon the southern shore. He wore his scholar's robe of pale silk, its folds fluttering in the faint breeze. Before him, an incense burner glowed softly, the smoke coiling upward like serpents of silver. He bowed to the north, to heaven, to earth, to the forces unseen that governed all things. The camp below was still. Even the soldiers who moments before murmured prayers of fear, now fell silent. The drums of war were hushed. Only the faint crackle of burning incense broke the quiet. Zhuge Liang lifted his feather fan. His eyes closed. He began to chant. Not loudly, but with a quiet rhythm that seemed to blend with the river's breath. The flames flickered, dimmed, then flared again, as if in answer. And then, it came. At first only a whisper, a delicate tremor that rippled across the stillness. The mist stirred, the smoke twisted, the banners fluttered. Then, suddenly, a surge. The air shifted, turning from west to east, swelling in strength until it roared across the river. The eastern wind had risen. Zhuge Liang opened his eyes, the corners of his lips curving in a faint, knowing smile. He lifted his fan toward the heavens, and at that signal, the Allied fleet moved. From the shadows of the southern bank, Zhou Yu's warships, laden with bundles of oil and fire, slipped forward. The wind caught their sails, carrying them swiftly toward the north. Torches ignited. The night was split open by streaks of flame. When the first burning ship struck the edge of Cao Cao's chained armada, the explosion shattered the silence. Fire leapt into the sky, brilliant and terrible. The flames spread from one vessel to the next, faster than men could scream. The chains that once bound them together became their doom. The entire northern fleet became a sea of fire. The Yangtze burned. The inferno painted the heavens red. Soldiers threw themselves into the river, their armor dragging them down. Horses shrieked. Drums fell silent beneath the roar of the blaze. Cao Cao's banners, once proud symbols of unity, crumbled into ash. From his altar, Zhuge Liang watched it all. The glow of the flames reflected in his calm eyes. He did not move, did not speak. Only the wind moved around him, his ally, his weapon, his prophecy fulfilled. In the distance, Zhou Yu fell to his knees in astonishment. "The wind truly obeys him," he whispered. But Zhuge Liang's voice, carried by that same wind, answered softly, "No, I only listened when the heavens spoke." As dawn neared, the fires began to fade, leaving the river littered with blackened wrecks. Smoke rose like ghosts over the water. The once invincible army of Cao Cao had been reduced to ashes, not by force, but by wisdom, patience, and the breath of nature itself. That day, on the banks of the Yangtze, a legend was born. Zhuge Liang, the man who borrowed arrows from the fog, who summoned wind from the heavens, had done what no army could. He had turned the tide of history with nothing but understanding, and as the last ember flickered out upon the dawn-lit waters, the fall of Cao Cao, the flames of destiny. The river burned that night. What began as a whisper of wind had become a storm of fire, a living, breathing beast that devoured everything in its path. The mighty armada of Cao Cao, once the symbol of northern power, now twisted and screamed upon the waters of the Yangtze. Flames leapt like serpents, swallowing sails, ropes, and men alike. The sound was not of battle anymore. It was of chaos, of destiny taking its due. Cao Cao's fleet had been chained together, an act of confidence or perhaps arrogance. He believed it would steady his ships against the southern currents, but that chain, that unbreakable link, became his undoing. When the fire came, there was no escape. The ships that once stood united now dragged each other down into the abyss. From the shore, the glow of the inferno painted the night sky red. The heavens roared. The air was thick with smoke and terror. Soldiers leapt into the black water, armor dragging them into the depths. Others screamed for their commander, their voices lost beneath the thunder of collapsing masts and the hiss of boiling waves. Cao Cao, once the proud and unstoppable warlord who marched across China like a god among men, was now a fugitive in his own empire. His eyes, sharp as blades, watched the dream of unification burn before him. He turned to flee, his generals scattering like leaves in a storm. Behind him, the empire he had built with sword and blood dissolved into embers on the river. And somewhere far from the panic, upon a small command ship veiled in mist, Zhuge Liang stood. The firelight flickered across his calm face, the silk of his robes fluttering in the eastern wind he had summoned. He did not shout. He did not celebrate. He simply watched. The fan in his hand waved gently, as if brushing away the last illusions of the northern ambition. To his side, Zhou Yu exhaled in disbelief.
How did you know?
Half awe, half envy. This wind, he murmured, it truly answers to him. Zhuge Liang's eyes followed the inferno stretching across the Yangtze. His voice was soft, almost lost to the crackle of flames. Fate answers only to those who understand it. In that instant, the fire and the wind became one, symbols of balance and retribution. Nature had chosen its side, and with it, history was rewritten. The fall of Cao Cao was not merely a defeat of armies, it was the triumph of intellect over force, of foresight over pride. As the dawn began to rise, the fires dimmed, leaving only drifting smoke and floating wreckage, a graveyard for ambition. The river, calm once more, carried the ashes of an empire downstream. Zhuge Liang stood at the bow of his ship, his gaze lost in the horizon. A faint smile touched his lips, not of arrogance, but of understanding. He had seen this end long before the first spark was lit. He knew that this was only one battle in a much greater war, the endless struggle for unity, for power, for destiny. And yet, for that brief moment, as the golden light of morning broke through the smoke, the strategist of Shu looked like a figure from legend, neither man nor god, but something in between. Behind him, the eastern wind whispered across the river, carrying with it the echoes of victory and the faint laughter of fate. The flames of destiny had burned bright, and in their light, history was forever changed.